Probably safer than recording now. And welcome to this webinar where we're going to get into a lot of fun conversations around commonly an objection, an easy objection, if I can say that, and I'm going to say that. So an easy objection I often heard thrown around about why an organization won't get into BaaS, why they are just not qualified, why they are not the perfect FI profile. And here's the qualifier, or in this case, the disqualifier that is being used. A lot of banks just think they're too small. And what we're here to do to talk about truly today is this whole concept of how small is too small for BaaS, if there is such a size differentiation or categorization, and what organizations that are playing in this space that might be much smaller than you would expect, what kind of questions they're asking themselves. And to do that, we have a grouping of the thought leaders on this call. Let's exclude myself from this conversation, but some of the individuals that you're going to see listed out here, and especially the two gentlemen on this slide, we are here to bring you a fun and entertaining conversation around this topic. How do I know it's going to be fun and entertaining? The prep call was an absolute ball. So I am going to go ahead and turn it over to our individuals here. Mr. Bishop, we'll have you as the caboose. We'll come back around to you if you don't mind. Matt, you're first up on my screen. Would you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about all of these letters I see with your title?
Yeah, there's a lot of letters there. It's nice to meet everybody, and thank you for having me. Excited to be a part of this. But yes, my name is Matthew DiGesti. I work for a sister affiliate of Genubank called JBNV Digital. Genubank is a community bank down in Las Vegas. Been around for about 13 years now. Does kind of bread and butter commercial deposits and commercial lending locally down in that community, with some aspirations to provide an embedded finance product to digital platforms nationwide. So we have a holding company structure, and JBNV Digital is a subsidiary of the holding company. And that's where Genubank performs its research and development activities as they relate to the embedded finance product that we're working to spin up.
Amazing. Well, it makes so much more sense whenever you say it in that very logical fashion, Matt. Thank you so much. Or do you prefer Matthew? I call you Matt because Steve calls you.
Either is completely fine.
All right. Very fair. Randy, let's bring it to you now, kind sir. Randy, go ahead and introduce yourself. We're going to get a lot more into Braid as well in this discussion, but let me give you a chance to represent yourself.
Sure. I do have a lot of letters in my last name, so I'm equally as complicated. My name is Randy St. Nicholas, and I'm the co-founder of Braid. I'm not a banker by trade, but I've spent the last 20 years building payment systems for banks and for fintechs that consume banking services. We founded Braid on a simple thesis that if you're big enough to have a Fed master account, you're big enough to play. And so we're really rooted in sort of the underdog story. We think that community financial institutions are the bedrock of the economy, and there's just this massive opportunity, yet it's not being tapped. And so we exist to unlock that opportunity for those who are typically left behind. So happy to be here, happy to contribute, and happy to have a ball.
I love this, and we are going to have a ball, and we're going to get a little bit deeper into just how you and I met over the course of our conversation as well. But I promised that we would get to the caboose of these introductions, Mr. Steve Bishop. Steve,
yeah, well, Randy, thank you for introducing yourself, because I've been calling you Randy St. Nicholas, and
I'll take it.
My kids are gonna be really disappointed because I had a direct line to the big guy. So
I do have the gut, so I am qualified.
I'm Steve Bishop, part of the amBaaSsador team. I built embedded finance at a community bank, and working on some new stuff that we'll be announcing soon. But excited to have this. Matt and Randy are it's gonna be fun. They're both thought leaders, like Stacy said, and just can't wait to get in and go.
Well, with that, here's how I think this conversation is going to go, or at least how I think it's going to go in my head, you guys. I have various questions that I'm going to ask each of you. Steve, I know you have some questions as well. Randy, you and Matt, please feel free to bubble up any questions that you would like for us to address as a group. Whole purpose here is to ensure that everyone is thinking in terms of BaaS as an alternative potentially for their FI, regardless of size. And that is the goal. And I want to start there, Steve. I'm going to direct this at you since you were kind enough to be patient for maybe the first time in your life and let other people go first and be the caboose. But Steve, you and I have quite a few conversations with community bankers around the country. And it is true that we often hear people saying, oh, I don't think we're big enough to get into BaaS. So why do you think bankers believe they're too small to get into BaaS?
Well, before I answer that, if other folks on the call joining have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. We'll
Very good.
try to well. I think probably the biggest reason is it's an easy excuse. It's something new, something unknown. So my default is I'm just not going to do it. And if you say why, well, I'm just not big enough. That's for the big banks. Or yeah, so there's a misnomer around it. I've been at a bank that was a little over $1 billion doing it. I've talked to banks 200 to 300 million doing it. I even talked to a bank that was at 50 million, and they were making a lot of money off of banking as a service because they had their core banking or where their roots, but they made a complete pivot into focusing on embedded finance as a future strategy. And so even at 50 million, they were asking me about loans because their legal lending limit was $1 million, and I was like, I got to look up their asset size because it seemed really low. But what they've done, like, so they're lending while they have that limit. Like, it'd be easy for them to sit and say, oh, we can only make up to $1 million loans. We're going to have a very slow growth rate. But instead, they didn't let that be a limiter. They said, how can we be an innovative bank? How can we look at the future and then have a business strategy that makes sense for us? So I think it's really, bankers historically like to find an excuse to say no, especially compliant people. It's because you're risk averse, right? Like, so if you say no, you don't get in trouble for saying no. It's when you accept that risk or venture out. So I think that's probably a lot of it if I was just to think out off the top of my head.
I agree with a lot of what you've said. I might say it a little softer, perhaps because I am in sales. So we'll work on that for you. But I also think that something that I hear quite a bit from organizations that are smaller, and just for the sake of our discussion, when I think of smaller banks, often at least in my mind, am thinking in terms of perhaps under 500 million in asset size, of which there are many playing in the BaaS space today. And that's the whole reason why I think you heard Randy mentioning that Braid exists to help elevate or at least empower banks within those asset sizes to play in the same arenas and take the same shots and have the same chances as what we see with multi-trillion-dollar organizations. But now that I've said that, another reason I think I sometimes hear an organization under 500 million or even under 750 say that they're too small or BaaS doesn't make sense. I think everyone also thinks that they are serving their local community and that focusing on their local community is the primary community. And I'm probably hopping ahead a little bit in the discussion, gentlemen, if I'm very honest with you, but what I tend to respond with or try to think in terms of is there's no reason in the world why these traditionally community-focused organizations have to focus solely on that local geographic community. In fact, with BaaS, they can expand into other communities. I see your head nodding, Steve. I was about to say I'm not even going to ask the rhetorical question of whether you agree, because I think we can all agree with that statement. But that is another reason I sometimes hear people say, BaaS isn't worth it, or BaaS isn't something for us because of our size and because we're focused on our local community. And I guess what I'm here to say, you can still focus on your local community and size doesn't have to be a disqualifier in the BaaS world. If we can all agree on that, I think we can continue on to the next question. If not, get your gloves because it's about to go down here. Randy, Matt, any feedback? Go ahead, take your shot.
No, I think as someone who has operated on the fintech side for many years, there was a certain point for me that I realized that fintechs in many ways create the confusion, right? When you think about a small bank was highly dependent on the vendor, that small bank's sort of worldview of product of opportunity revolves completely around that vendor, right? And so when I started thinking about like what are the challenges and what are the main barriers to entry, most of them are not technical, right? Obviously, the most obvious is fear of change, right? Nobody wants to change. Second thing is incorrect definition of success, right? When I look out into the marketplace, I see these major players, working with the likes of Brex and Mercury and so on and so forth. And you automatically think, well, I will never be able to play in those fields. And so I think, I'm a fintech guy, and so I take responsibility for contributing to that sort of facade.
Your fault.
Yeah, my fault. I think that it's if we can get past those softer sort of barriers, there's room for the smaller, organizations to play. That was a lot of
Okay.
words, but yeah.
I like it.
Mm.
I agree with you. We're going to get into some of those components as well as far as success metrics. Before we do though, Matt, let me give you a chance. Do you want to take a shot? You want to take a shot at me? Do you
Yeah,
disagree?
I would just add one additional thought to piggyback on what you were saying earlier, Stacey. I think that having started to build this embedded finance line of business out with a community bank in Las Vegas, what we found is they can sit side by side. It's not an either or, and in fact, it can be complementary if you do it correctly. And our bank down in Las Vegas is investing in growing the traditional side. So we're adding board members that have better referral, channels in the community. We're also adding business development folks to bring in more deposits. But what we're seeing with our embedded finance strategy is if we do it correctly, you can bring in commercial deposits that could serve as core deposits to help increase the lending capacity of the bank. And so, for GenuBank, it's a way to increase the traditional lending side and bring in, money nationwide that can be deployed in the local community on a lending bank, which I think is important to not lose sight of as well. So certainly not an either or. I definitely see it as complementary to what traditional community banks do.
Exactly. And as success grows, yes, funding your own banks, your own bank's lending portfolio, there are other things that have already been thought through as far as bringing in more capital and now what to do with that capital, how we can successfully allocate it. We can get into those discussions as well. But Randy, before we go on to the next question, I know this is the longest first question in the history of webinars, you all, but just kind of one more thing. You mentioned that fintechs, we might have created this problem of the small bank mentality as well, or help perpetuate this for organizations. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one of those organizations that you mentioned, Mercury. Candidly, their bank sponsor is about 200 million in asset size. So I find that extremely interesting when you start looking at just the space. And most everyone knows Mercury these days. If you don't, I would encourage you to go out and check them out. They are all over the small business space, and they are being powered by an organization that may be your size, maybe even a little bit smaller. So that's just for what that's worth. Think about that for just a moment, folks. But I think I'm going to get into the next conversation if you guys are game. And Randy, this one might fall especially into your wheelhouse because a lot of small banks, or candidly any bank that is tiptoeing into learning about banking as a service, they have this idea that they need to overhaul their entire bank. They're not exactly equipped. And you and I had a super interesting conversation, and you had made a comment where, do you know what comment I'm going with, Randy? Where you said,
No, you're gonna have to refresh my memory. I'm
"Oh,
sorry.
he dropped so much wisdom from his mouth and from his fingertips on the keyboard that he can't keep track of it. I get it; it's a legit thing." But you said they're closer than they think, and that is
Yeah.
so true. Because I think as Steve, and for those of you that don't know, Mr. Bishop here went through this process over a course of 3 to 4 years learning about banking as a service. being married to the gentleman. I went along on this ride with him as well, learned quite a bit about banking as a service, and there is a ton to learn. But I guess, Steve, one thing that you had found, and I'll invite Randy to weigh in on here, is that you're doing the same thing as a banker always does, which I think is why Randy's comments about you're closer than you think were so powerful, because bankers are still providing compliance checks, they're still moving money, they're still opening accounts, be it deposits or loans. And with that, Randy, what comments might you have about for these banks that think they have to completely overhaul their tech stack?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's
Their
a big
world,
one, actually. Yeah, that's a
their
big one.
world.
So I think that, when you think about like the thousands of use cases that exist today, right, out there, it's very difficult to kind of map that to like the foundational components that make up payment processing and managing deposits. Again, because we do a great job from a fintech perspective of creating this complexity, and all these nice buzzwords and such, right? So that I think that creates maybe unintentional mystification layer, right? And
Mhm.
so when I talk to a new bank, the first thing that I ask is, take inventory of what you already have at minimum to ground you, right? So once you're grounded in the fact that regardless of the APIs, regardless of what layer exists on top of you or besides you, that ultimately it's going to result in a fixed width file, which is a notch file, or a Fedware file. It's going to pass through your back office no matter what, and onto the Fed and so on and so forth. And so, I think once that understanding is sort of there's an aha moment, then you can look at the options, right, and weigh them correctly, right? And
Mhm.
I think that's such an important piece. And then you start to realize, wait a minute, I am closer than I originally thought. And I can ask good questions. I can have meaningful conversations with potential partners. Hopefully that added some
It
context.
did.
Yeah.
And it actually kind of brought up something that Matt, you had mentioned during our prep call, where you were saying, listen, there is this opportunity to leverage investments that the bank already has. Randy, that's exactly where my mind went after you mentioned taking stock of what you have and what you do presently. Matt, during the call, I believe you had called out things relative to some KYC identification elements. Would you like to expand upon that? And as far as investments that bankers have already made into some of these technologies that can then be leveraged. Am I leading you? Am I leading the witness,
You are leading
counselor?
the witness,
I
but
am. All
I don't
right.
think
A little
there's a
bit.
rule against that. So I appreciate the runway. Yeah, and in my experience doing this for Bank now, we from the technology side of things, we are not doing a rebuild of Bank. To Randy's point, we came in, we looked at what Bank had in place as far as technology and service providers, and we figured out what could be repurposed. And I think the most important thing to identify is that no core conversion was needed for us. And I think I can safely say that a core conversion is probably not required for any community bank that wants to get into the embedded finance space. What we ended up doing is contracting with Treasury Prime, which is integrated with our core provider, Fiserv, to provide sort of the technical sophistication we needed, particularly from an API-based system, to be able to then embed that technology in our partner platforms that we're partnering with. And all of that work had already been done by Treasury Prime. So when you go and you speak with Treasury Prime, they have the integration. It's just a matter of spinning it up and testing it. And to Randy's point, a lot of the back office functions that the community banks are accustomed to using, their systems are probably adequate and don't need that much fine tuning.
Mhm.
For us, we had to upgrade our ACH and wire software in order for it to provide a better customer experience, but we didn't have to do that. We chose to do that. And that wasn't a
Gotcha.
large investment either. And so when you get to like the Treasury Prime level, you then start talking about, okay, what other vendors am I going to need in order to deliver these services? And to your point with KYC is one of them. We had the option of continuing to use our KYC provider or select a new one. And we're likely going to select a new one that is already pre-integrated with Treasury Prime. So no additional costs or expenses or investments by the bank in order to do it. We do have to sign up a new vendor and contract with them, but the process flows through down to the core and integrates quite nicely with what the bank already does as far as, policies and systems and back office work. And so, the road's fairly clear. It's not reinventing the wheel. It's not rebuilding the bank's infrastructure from the ground up. It's really complementing what the bank already has in place to extend it out to your embedded platforms.
Yeah.
So
Well, thank you
Matt,
for that. Oh,
I wanted to kind of lean in because I know technology is easy. It's just ones and zeros. But you mentioned this community bank. Like, have you seen common, like the human element? Like, are there certain like, pushbacks that you see, or what have been the biggest challenges that you've seen from getting like, let's leverage what we have. That includes our personnel, but getting them to take on. Is there any thoughts? I mean, I'm assuming it's relationship based, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's absolutely relationship based. I think that um, the biggest thing I would highlight is sort of I think it's the education piece for traditional bankers that have not worked in this space before. And when they think about BaaS, and I don't be stereotypical, and I'm not speaking specifically to anybody at Genu Bank, but I think that the general reaction to traditional community bankers is that the only exposure they've had before they've actually looked at it because they're considering it is the news and the consent orders and all of the bad stuff that comes out that comes across their email newsletters. And so I think generally speaking, you start out from a position of pretty extreme skepticism because that's all the
Mhm.
information that they've taken in. And so to get to that education piece, once you start working with traditional bankers, and you have to understand how their processes work today because they're familiar with it, they're comfortable with it, they've been through exam cycles, and frankly, they're proud of their work, right? Because that's the work that they provide to the bank. And so if you get a good understanding of where they are, I think you can educate them on where you need to go and how the technology works in order to get them comfortable. But it takes an education process. Like it takes explaining it to them. It takes systems level architecture with, data flows and fund flows visuals so they can see how this data is being collected, how it's flowing through their traditional systems, but also flowing through, in our case, Treasury Prime and these new vendors that we're bringing on board in a way that complements what they do, today. And then I think you take away the skepticism around like, oh, this is a black box. I don't understand it. It's too difficult. We'd have to redo the entire bank's infrastructure. And you start knocking off those skepticisms that are just inherent because they don't have any experience in that area. And I think if you do it appropriately, it gets you to where, everybody's aligned and you can move down the path that you want to move down.
yeah, agreed. I want to step back for just a second because, Matt, you had said something very poignant. Randy, I would imagine this is your view on the world as well. And you said that banks don't need to swap out their core system or make any big tech changes. And you mentioned Treasury Prime. There are others out there in the industry of which, Randy, I know that while you guys have a bit of a different model than Treasury Prime, you're doing the same type of thing as well, providing this functionality to bankers. And I guess I'm wondering, when you are having these conversations with small banks, I know you all recently had one, even a larger bank, but for our purposes, working with small banks, are you listening for any triggers that let you know, this FI, they're ready for BaaS. They are ready to begin thinking about it and to deploy specifically what we do at Braid, which is kind of more of an in-house deployment.
That's a good one. So usually it's, there's a deep curiosity at the C-suite level, number one, and maybe even a little emotion, right? Because there's also this sense of, these fintechs are out here taking my lunch and everyone's doing it. I'm being left behind. What do I need to do? And with that comes a sense of humility, right? And so those are the things I look for. The biggest challenge that I face when I'm talking to, potential customers is everything's fine. Everything is
Mm-hmm.
just a-okay. I don't need to change. And so like the education process, like Matt mentioned, also includes, from my perspective, like look at the market, like this is happening, it is going to happen, are you prepared for that, or for that eventual change?
So true. I was at an FRB of Kansas City event. In fact, I think I'm going to do a LinkedIn post on this, but there was a comment made which made me just stop and actually write it down. The comment was this: we either mature the industry or the industry matures us. And I think we're at the stage right now with banking as a service where if you're not looking at this and you're not thinking about it and at least exploring it with an open mind, I fear that you're going to find the industry matures you and forces you to play a little bit of catch up. Where right now you could be matic about it and make some really neat decisions that are great for your FI. I'm not sure if that lands with any of you all, but that comment absolutely just smacked me in the face when I heard it. And I immediately thought of banking as a service there. Steve, I know I've been dominating the question asking. Is there anything I'll defer to you for one. You get one, buddy.
I've already asked one, so I don't know if that's
Well, that's your question right there. And you said you don't know if that one already counts. Moving on. Just kidding. No, do you have a question you'd like to ask?
I don't know, like when I'm trying to step back because I have strong opinions on this space, but I think it's easy to think that it's a big bank play. Like the cities or the chases, they have this infrastructure, they have this dev shop that they can just throw things at it and go to market.
Mhm.
You think of community banks, they're a relationship, which that's hard to translate into tech. But they quarter, how does a smaller bank, like what are some things that they can leverage to show that nimbleness? I'd be curious to get thoughts on what, like, not why do we leave this to the big banks, but what actually makes a smaller bank better equipped to do BaaS?
I have tons of thoughts on this topic. So, I get excited when I talk to smaller institutions because in many cases they don't realize that they have characteristics, that resemble a startup, right? You don't have the resources, you're understaffed, which means that there's cross-pollination across all disciplines, right? Someone can walk over to the wire terminal and process wires. This person can run OFAC, right? And so to me, that is the gold, right? And when you take that sort of cross skill set and then you bundle that with just the deep appreciation for relationships, then overlay that and or augment it with a little bit of technology, that's where the superpower comes, it becomes exposed. And so I think, looking at the organizational level, again, because from my perspective and my point of view is that this is not a technical problem. I think you guys share the same opinion. And so we're constantly trying to solve for, that fear of change and then, the annihilation of every barrier to entry so that it's literally reduced to fear of change.
Which is a big one. Let's be honest. It is a big one, but here's one way that I think we can like at least begin to redefine that fear of change or challenge it a bit. And that's this definition of success. We spoke about this in the prep call, and Randy, you made a great comment that success for every bank within the BaaS space, especially for smaller ones, might be different. It doesn't have to be hundreds of programs. It doesn't have to be 50 programs. It doesn't have to be 10 programs. And I guess I would just invite you to chat with us a little bit about what kind of conversations you're having related to success. And then Matt, I want to bring the same kind of question over to you if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'm usually talking to the CEO, right? And it's one of my favorite parts of the job. And so, from my perspective, a community bank is a small business trying to make its way, right? And so it's the same. I've been a small business operator most of my career. And so the whole struggle around what is my organization going to look like? Where is my next customer coming from? Who's coming, who's coming for me? You start to talk about there's this opportunity and you have to start somewhere, right? And so I just literally start throwing out numbers. What would your bank look like if you brought in $10,000 a month, $20,000 a month? And then eventually someone lights up, right?
Mm-hmm.
That number is what I need, or what I want rather. And then you just start having a conversation around potential customers that sort of match that revenue sort of target. And then the conversation becomes a little more concrete. So for me, the challenge is always sort of bringing it down from the clouds and saying, like, you can do this. Like, we're not talking about, like, building a unicorn here. We're talking about building a decent book of business. You have the raw materials to make it happen. Let's talk about that, the raw materials that you already have. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's going to make a substantive change within that organization when you start layering on those additional amounts, which may come from one program, one fintech program at the end of the day. Matt, do you all, as you're kicking things off with GenuBank, is there some magical number if you're at liberty to say, or are you just more interested in building a program that makes sense, that can grow with you? I've not asked you this before, so forgive me for putting you on the spot. But hey, let me put you on the spot.
Yeah, I don't think there's a magical number. But what I do think is, I mean, when we're looking at potential partners, and to sort of tie in Steve's earlier comment on, how are we going to compete with big banks? What makes a community bank differentiated? When we look at platform partners, we look at our embedded finance services as really bread and butter banking, right? But we're extending those services out beyond what we traditionally do and delivering them through a digital channel in an embedded way on our partners' platforms. And that's, 90% of our strategy. It's 90% of the technology we're building. And any community bank can do that. Any big bank can do that. And so I totally understand, like, the fear around, well, why would we make these investments if we're going to be competing with folks both
Yep.
of our asset size, bigger than our asset size, and the GSIBs? Why? I mean, what makes this a good investment? And the way we think about it, we fortunately have an investor that's very technology focused, and we are technology focused when it comes to our embedded finance strategy. And so the way we differentiate ourselves is we're focused very heavily on identity, and that's the identity of our commercial partners, but more importantly, the end users on the platform that would be consuming our embedded banking services. And taking a process that banks already do, which is, they KYC those end users, they have all of that verified data, which is just a cost center, right? Because you got to pay people to verify that, you got to host it, you have to secure it. All of that costs money. We asked ourselves, like, what can we do with that asset that's currently not making any revenue, but it's there and could potentially unlock a new revenue stream and differentiate ourselves when it comes to selling our services to partner platforms. And so we've created some proprietary technology around GenuBank issuing verified identity for the end users on our partner platforms. And our go-to-market strategy is to identify partner platforms that not only need embedded banking services, because they have a desire to embed those services, but in addition, would those platform partners benefit from a bank-issued identity or verified identity data on that platform? And we're talking to one potential partner that has a huge need for identity verification on their platform of the end consumers. They currently do it in-house. They're not a fintech. They're certainly not a bank. And it's a lot of overhead and a lot of process that they're not accustomed to doing. They're accustomed to coding and delivering a really good customer experience. And so part of our differentiation, and I think why they're considering us as a partner, even though we are a small community bank, is we could deliver this extra service, something we already do, but do it in a new and sort of innovative way that could take all of that overhead and responsibility off of them and their platform, get them totally focused on what they do best, and allow us to provide that service for them. And so what I would encourage banks that are looking to get into the embedded space, especially smaller banks, is, are there any areas around the edges where you can make a little bit more investment and differentiate yourself on how you can provide an additional service to a platform to really get that hook in and move those conversations forward?
Love this, Matt. I love that you are leaning into something that I often hear. I've heard others in the space mention as far as finding their niche. You find that area in your case with GenuBank, a fintech that not only needs a sponsor bank, but could benefit from these identity services for their end users. For other institutions, that might be, we have a really strong commercial portfolio, and we want to look for, commercially oriented organizations that are doing X in the space. For some FIs, they cater to affinity groups, people that are doctors or lawyers, or they craft a whole strategy, an embedded strategy that somewhat complements what they're already doing on the community banking side. They're just leaning into it more and extending it out nationally through all of these fintechs that cater also to those same niches or affinity groups. So I think that's a strong, strong strategy. It brings to mind something that I'm sitting here thinking of with a fintech that might be evaluating a small bank. I guess I'm wondering if there's a large fintech and you are, as a smaller bank, trying to sell to these very large fintechs looking for a bank sponsor, is there a reason why they should say no just based on size? And I guess I'm leading you here. I have something in mind. I guess I'm leading you towards, and Steve's smiling already, but let me answer for you, Matt. The answer is no. The answer is always no, because
I presume.
what I have found is that a fintech doesn't have to just use one sponsor bank, right? And they can use different sponsor banks for different capacities and different services, which still enables them to play with banks like Genubank, banks with Randy, with whom you serve in the braid space, and they can off-put other elements of their service model, these fintechs, to other FIs. So let me stop, because I've led you all down the path of where I wanted you to go with this conversation. But how does that strike you? Does that seem like a viable route? Because I know it's happening every single day out there in the space. Is that a strategy you guys have seen some banks use? Or is Genubank thinking about that strategy with large fintechs? Longest questions ever, you all. Longest questions ever today.
I'll
I
try to
got 2
answer
weeks
it.
left in.
I'll try to answer it the best that I can. The answer is yes. And I'll give you a couple examples, and not necessarily what Genubank is looking at, but things that I've seen as sort of trends in the industry. Um, with bank sponsors, where a fintech may want multiple bank sponsors, or where a fintech could benefit from leveraging different services that banks could bring in. I see these networks popping up, where these networks that are being built, whether they're networks of banks or networks of like fintechs coming in with multiple sponsor banks. It's sort of like it's spreading out the operational component so that the fintechs are diversifying. It's always good to diversify with your bank sponsors, especially under administrations that are more heavy-handed. So it's always good to do that. But there's certain services you can tap into where it just makes the fintech's life a lot easier. For example, like IntraFi is a really good example, right?
Yep.
When you open accounts at banks, you have FDIC insurance up to a certain amount, but if those balances are beyond, the $250,000 per account, you don't want to go to a single bank and open up 15 accounts and top each up at 250, right? In order to get full coverage. But if you leverage IntraFi, you can work with one bank as a fintech. You can have one account, and your multi-million-dollar deposit can actually be spread out through the IntraFi network, and you get FDIC insurance coverage because they're breaking it up into $250,000 pieces across different partners in the IntraFi bank. And so that's really interesting, right? Because now you're working with one bank partner, but you're getting the benefit of having multiple fully insured accounts that all work seamlessly with your relationship with just the bank partner itself. And so I am seeing trends like that. There's some interesting things that are popping up. Treasury Prime has a one key solution, where they're trying to, within their network for banks that leverage Treasury Prime, they're trying to set up an interbank transfer network where, you can just do instant book transfers at very, very little cost on the Treasury Prime network. So if you're a bank, or if you're a fintech, excuse me, that has two sponsor banks, and both of those sponsor banks happen to be Treasury Prime consumers, you could take advantage of this one key network, which is really just a real-time payments book transfer between those two banks, and increase your speed, lower your cost to move money between your bank accounts. And so there's trends like that I'm seeing that I think are really helpful to fintechs and also really helpful to community banks that are trying to sell their services. It's like, hey, we can't do this on our own, but if we join these networks, we can extend our services, offer you much better customer support.
You know, Matt, you bring up a excellent point with InterFi. I think that was when I was first looking at this space, we had a certain dollar amount we keep on our balance sheet before it just blew up our capital structure.
Mm-hmm.
So I put in verbiage in my first MSA that said, like, you can only grow up to, like, you know, it was just like very like trying to protect myself. And then I learned about InterFi, and I learned like it doesn't matter. Like, I had a client I signed that was almost twice the size of assets as I had at the bank, and I was comfortable doing that because of the InterFi network. So it's, you could even do multiples beyond just 2x, like, and achieve that without negatively impacting your balance sheet from a capital structure. So that was a very key point there. Now, Mrs. Bishop, I want to take a slightly different view from what you said. I'm only disagreeing because we're in a public forum, so I feel safe.
You feel safe? You feel protected? Okay,
You're gonna pay for that. You'll pay for that later.
I think, you know, smaller banks have a opportunity, like you were saying, and multiple sponsors. I signed some very big ones at a smaller bank, but there's also there are some fintechs that smaller banks should probably avoid. I was talking to a founder a couple months ago in New York, and he was actually a previous customer, and he's like, you know, after we get our next series raised, we're probably going to go to another platform or another bank. And he's like, you know what they cost? It was like they were probably about 8 times what my platform fee was, but he wanted to go to them just because they were a name brand. So it's almost like a luxury item. So you'll see some banks that can actually do it. They'll probably be bigger banks. They have this luxury brand, and if a fintech wants to use their runway, their burn rate on that high platform fee, that'll probably come to light pretty easy. So, but there is that counter. It's, I would think that banks should never feel like they're too small to play in the game, but there are some players that aren't going to be a part of that game, and you're better off just avoiding it.
That's true. As with all things, all partnerships. Yeah.
I was thinking about that. Just I wanted to add to Matt's comments around the network effects, right? So that was an interesting take. So, you know, we're already seeing that with Braid banks, right? So we have 5 banks on our roster, and they're all independently running their instance of Braid. And the natural sort of alignment between partner and bank is going to fall into a few buckets, right? One, it's risk appetite, verticals, right? And so you have one fintech that will get deployed on one bank, but maybe bank A says, no, I don't want to touch that line of business. I'll take this little sliver, right? And then the remaining business can roll over to the next bank. And so I think that natural network effect serves both sides, you know, of the relationship. You know, not a single bank is going to take all the business, and a single fintech is going to take all the business. And so creating opportunities for businesses to be able to throttle over, you know, based on risk appetite, you know, business opportunity, those things are, I think, are sort of a natural, you know, occurrence.
Conversation. I love this networking conversation within the FI space and across banks within the BaaS space specifically. All right, gentlemen, let's talk about if there is a small bank, and any bank actually that might be listening to this, what are some of the first steps they should be taking in the BaaS world if they want to learn more about banking as a service? I'd love to know for each of you. So Randy, you came from a different background. Matt, you definitely came from a different background, sir, than the traditional banking space. Steve, as did you. So I would imagine you guys just weren't plopped into your present roles knowing everything about banking as a service. I'd love to know what steps you would suggest for somebody that's kind of exploring this space, especially if they happen to be smaller in asset size.
I mean, I could talk about like what we do now. So when we're talking to, you know, everything should revolve around a customer, right? Because the challenge when the opportunity and the problem that banking as a service represents is that you're creating a utility that can be pointed at just about any use case, right? It's the beautiful thing about what a community bank possesses. And so, you can easily fall into let's boil an ocean conversation, right? And so what we do when we're talking to a new potential bank customer is we bring the first 1, 2, 3 customers and we frame the conversation around a specific use case. And that way we're talking about, and this is before the contract is even signed, right? So the best way to get yourself educated is around a specific use case, because then the context is set. I know what compliance framework matters. I know what infrastructure I need, and then I can size that up against my internal team. So that's our approach.
So a bank chooses to do business with Braid. Braid brings the first few customers to them.
Actually, even before the relationship. So this is the challenge, right? So what do I do, Randy? Great, that sounds wonderful. Hold on, I'll be right back, right? Run over here, grab FinTech A, B, C. Here, this is John Smith, and he runs this FinTech over here. This is what he's looking for. And then it's more of an exploratory conversation as opposed to a hard pitch, right? So it's like dating. Let's talk about what this could look like before we actually enter contract negotiations. And I will say that that in some circles that would not be considered a good business practice, but Braid is so mission focused. We're totally focused on enabling the smallest institutions to be able to participate, and we'll do whatever it takes to get them educated, even if it requires us to run around and pluck fintechs out of the woodworks and to bring them over again. So
that's one of the reasons I so enjoy every conversation we have, is because of your mission and your passion for serving the smallest banks, including the smallest bank in the US. Randy, you and I still have more conversations to have along those lines. Really fun ideas in that regard. Matt, what about you? Here you were bebopping along in your more just legal facing role, attorney, obviously turned technologist, or is there a better phrasing that I should use? Were you a technologist hiding behind a briefcase? Perhaps that's more appropriate.
I think I was an attorney that turned technologist who's still an attorney, I guess.
Okay, still an attorney, not disbarred, folks. Let's be clear about this.
Very, very low bar when we're defining technologist. I don't claim to be a technologist, but an attorney who understands technology.
I love it. So how did you go about educating yourself on banking as a service? What did that look like?
Yeah, so I, to your point, I came at it from the other side, similar to Randy. I came at it from the fintech side. My first exposure was when I was the chief legal officer for online lending fintech. We did point of sale online lending, and we had the opportunity to work with a bank out of Utah to spin up a partner program on point of sale lending. And so my first exposure was coming at it from building the fintech side of the program and working with this bank in Utah to get it through all of their internal approval processes and to develop the technology alongside them to deliver the product. And so I came at it from that perspective, but I didn't jump into this full time until really the beginning of the year when I got moved over to sort of the GenuBank side of the family. And here's what I did, and I found it to be super helpful. The first thing I did is I bought this book, and it's not on my desk because I was ready to plug it, but it literally sits next to my desk. I'll read it.
What does that say? It's blurry.
The title is Banking as a Service, and it's by Jason Makula. It's a wonderful resource.
Not to Jason. Yeah.
I've read this twice now. And so I think step one is really self-educating, and you can do it through books. If you like holding paper in your hand, you can certainly do it with the new AI, chat bots. Perplexity has been really helpful for me. And so I'm a self-educator by nature, and so it comes very naturally to me, but I found that to be a super helpful first step. And then the next step would be to do things like you're doing today. I mean, you guys have signed up for this podcast in order to hear from people who are in the space. And it's part of the self-education process. But to take that next leap, what I would recommend, certainly any of the four of us that are talking today, our DMs on LinkedIn are wide open if you wanted to schedule a call and just get any answers to questions you might have, to the extent that we can answer them. And starting to talk to people in the space who I have found by and large are very willing to get on calls and to have Q&A sessions, specifically around what you're thinking is very, very helpful. And then the last step, well, the next step would be what Randy talked about. That piece is so important. Like there's no point in starting to invest more than your time if you don't understand what your basic strategy is, what your use case is, how your bank might be differentiated in providing a BaaS product. And once you get to that step, I would highly recommend getting to the point where you start spending a little bit of money. And what I found to be very helpful is we got connected with three different groups, three different consulting groups through our banking attorney that do work in this space. And they do particularly risk and compliance management work, both for the fintechs and the sponsor banks. So they have views and experience into building it out from both sides. And I have found that just talking to them, they've been so helpful. They're helpful in introducing you to people that you should talk to. They're helpful in answering your questions before you actually have to sign a retainer agreement. They're very, very thoughtful. And so I think that's a wonderful next step. And that gets you to the point where if you do want to take the step of seeing like, hey, I need to start putting together a strategy, a technology strategy, and at least a lightweight sort of budget and forecast for feasibility, I would recommend hiring one of the consulting groups to help you through that process. And you can go month to month. You can control the costs and how much they're going to charge you each particular month. But you're going to get to the point where you sort of cleared the brush and you have a good understanding of whether like this is something that we want to get into because it's potentially profitable, or it's something we should just pack our bags up and move on because it's not going to work for us.
Yeah,
That's the process that's been helpful to me.
I love it. Forgive me for interrupting. An educated
okay.
decision at that point. Well, Steve, I know you, and I'll kind of wrap this with you, and then we can chat about how folks can connect. But you were educating before Jason Mikula had put out his book, before ChatGPT and Perplexity and things were a thing. How did you go about, because you're an old man, basically, is what I just made you feel like, and I didn't mean to, but how did you go about taking your first steps into this space?
Now I'd get my newspaper that was delivered every day. I would unfold it, and then I would find a name. And I go to the phone booth and I drop my quarters in.
Exactly.
No, it's all about networking and creating those relationships. And like just like Matt said, we're all open and like people are open to conversations. And this isn't it's me versus you, only one of us are going to win. That's what's beautiful about this is banks and fintechs win together. And oh, by the way, there are so few sponsor banks right now that even the banks aren't fighting. And like there are enough customers or like fintechs looking for sponsor banks that it's not that hard to find them. And you'll have it's finding that fit, that network of people that align with you and their values. So if you take that local community and what's important to you, like let's just like if it's a farming community, you could look at ag fintechs and I know that those seem to be very different, but there's a lot of tech in farming. And we'll see more and more fintechs that are servicing that farming. So you could have that niche of farm, like agricultural tech that you're bringing from a nationwide perspective, like that you're servicing it because that's what you know and that's what you love. So you can build those networks and learn through that. It's a lot easier now than it was 4 years ago. It was a lot of boots on the ground conferences, knowing people. But now, I mean, the consent orders create a lot of awareness for the space, but they also are a rule book and a guidebook that banks can use as what not to do, because there were a lot of things that were done, and it wasn't that banks were trying necessarily to do bad things. They just didn't know or have to take the time for the appropriate guardrails around them. So I know we're coming up on time. Not sure if there's any, but I'll turn it back to Mrs. Bishop.
Well, I was just about to say, I know how Tim Ferriss feels at the end of his 2.5 hour interviews where he has pages of notes he said he didn't get to. I have pages of questions I didn't get to because I was so enthralled with the answers that this group of individuals was providing out there for us. I hope what we've all just given some thought to is the simple fact that there is no one right size for a bank to begin to explore the banking as a service, the BaaS environment. And there's no shortage of helpful people, helpful talent like Randy and Matt and Steve and others that are out in this space to assist you. If I can ask anything of you, please connect with these two faces that you see here on the screen, Matt and Randy both. Randy, I get the biggest kick out of the post that you put out there, such valuable insight, and then also teaching me a few things with Whisper here and there. Matt, I need you to entertain me more. If you wanna just start posting directly to me on LinkedIn, if you want, that's okay. But no, you have such wisdom that you also share in the conversations that you and I have had. These two are a gold mine of details and insights about what it takes to formulate good BaaS programs, regardless of asset size. And with that, I'm going to invite each of you to have a fantastic day. If you're so inclined as well, and give us a follow out on the amBaaSsador that page, because we are going to continue to put out content like this, articles and newsletters and other interviews with hopefully Matt and Randy again, where I let them speak even more. Steve, you speak enough. So with that, I'll go ahead and let everyone go. I hope everyone has a fantastic day. Have a wonderful time exploring BaaS. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See ya. Okay, well, seriously, I hardly got into anything, you gentlemen. I